From Chicago's CAN TV, this is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there, and welcome to Chicago Newsroom right here on CAN TV. I'm Ken Davis, where we sit around the table and we talk about the things that we think are really important in our town. And here's one that I think is pretty important. Where are we at on Chicago police reform? Shall we take a moment to review the basics? Well, there have been calls for reform in the way Chicago recruits and trains and deploys its policing for decades, but after Laquan McDonald, there was, you may remember, intense pressure for big change. And the federal government stepped in. President Obama, remember him? The Justice Department came out with a detailed, powerful report outlining all kinds of shortcomings, making recommendations for reform. And right about the exact same time, a reform commission that Mayor Emanuel himself appointed came out with another report, pretty similar, kind of a scathing report about what the police department needed to do. Then Donald Trump happened, and his Justice Department pretty much said that it wasn't interested in meddling with how the police departments do their work. So since then, the mayor has said he would carry on without the DOJ. And then he seemed to waffle on that, and a bunch of civil rights organizations have sued, and more public officials are coming out every day telling the mayor he needs to get reform rolling. And meanwhile, the police rank and file have put their union under new management. They're in no mood for what the public is calling reform. So it is a big mess, and Bill Ruthhart's been covering it all along, so we asked him to come by, sit at the table for us a little while, Chicago Tribune, to explain it all to us so that by the end of our show today, you will have explained everything to us and we will understand what's going on.
I don't know about everything, but I will do my best.
Do your very best. You know what, can I just start with a really dumb question, because I've been reading, you've written several really good articles about this in the last couple of weeks. And I just this very morning, sat down and reread them all again and suddenly realized that I don't think I really understand what a consent decree is. What the hell is it? We've all been talking about it for a year.
Well, a consent decree is basically a process in which traditionally it's been the Justice Department and whatever policing agency or municipality, even the state of Illinois has had a consent decree for many years on the Department of Children and Family Services. So it's when basically, in layman's terms, something is so screwed up that it needs long-term reform, and the local officials, it's deemed that it's best that it's not just the politicians oversee that reform, but a federal judge. And so it can take on all kinds of different forms, but essentially, the judge is in charge of overseeing the agreed upon reforms. An independent monitor is appointed by the court to make sure those reforms happen. That monitor has the power of the court behind it to get access to records and documents that may not be publicly accessible under just the FOIA law, for example. And so the idea is it is the strongest form of trying to seek reform or fix something in government or in a public agency that is very broken.
So the parties sit down and they, I suppose, just write up a giant document saying this is what we intend to accomplish, or what?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. I mean, sometimes consent decrees are the end result of a lawsuit that's filed, and then through litigation, there's ultimately a resolution that these are the agreed upon terms, or these are the terms ordered by the judge, and these are the reforms that need to happen. The guiding post with Chicago police reform, it probably starts with the Justice Department investigation you mentioned, 13-month investigation that found all kinds of widespread, deep-rooted, decades-long problems within the department, from patterns of misconduct, excessive force. There's been discussion of, isolated or perhaps widespread, depending on your opinion, incidents of racism between officers and the public. And so when the Justice Department came out with that report, Rahm Emanuel stood up with Attorney General Loretta Lynch and a bunch of federal officials who oversaw the investigation. This was in January, after President Trump had already been elected, I might note. This is the waning days of the Obama administration. And he stood up and said, yes, a consent decree is necessary. This needs federal court oversight. He signed a written agreement committing that he would seek a federal consent decree. And then a few weeks later, the Trump administration comes into office. And what's interesting, and what we don't quite have a clear picture of, because the mayor won't answer the questions and neither will the Justice Department, is how do we get from this written agreement for a consent decree to where we are now, which is the mayor negotiating with Attorney General Jeff Sessions' Justice Department on what's called a memorandum of agreement, which is not a court-enforced agreement. It's an agreement between the Justice Department and the city. And so we've asked the mayor numerous times who initiated this. He's walked away from the podium, not answered the question. His administration likes to say, well, this wasn't our idea. But it's not clear whether the Emanuel administration wanted to stick to the consent decree and the Justice Department said, no, we're not doing a consent decree, let's do this instead. It sounds like perhaps the City Hall drew up this draft of this agreement and shuttled it over to the Justice Department. The mayor's office says they have an agreement in principle to do this memorandum of agreement. The Justice Department says there is no agreement in principle. We haven't agreed to anything. They just sent this to us and we're looking at it. So,
and on the day that the mayor announced that they had it, did the Justice Department say, oh, we just got this thing?
Yes, exactly. And nobody's really talking about the back channel. You know, was there a lot of discussions that led up to this, or did Emanuel just drop this on their doorstep, or what happened?
We are talking about Rahm Emanuel here, and he's let's just say he's masterful at politics. And it would not be unreasonable to take the cynical view that this whole big deal of standing up with Loretta Lynch and saying we're going to go all the way on this was a very cynical move, because he knew the legs were going to get cut out just weeks later. So it didn't matter what he said.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not here to judge the cynicism
I'm not
of it.
asking you to do that.
I certainly would not try to get inside the mind of Rahm Emanuel. But I did point out that he knew who had been elected president. He knew, the position of Trump and Sessions on consent decrees, and they've since, signaled they have no interest in having court oversight of consent decrees. I'm not even sure they have interest of a memorandum of agreement over police departments. They've very much taken the position that the police should be given full leeway to do their jobs, and Trump was heavily endorsed by FOP, including the Chicago FOP, and so you have very different politics there. I think Emanuel, as you know, is a very smart politician, and I think perhaps what he underestimated in this case was to the extent at which the public cares and how the reforms happen. I think perhaps the thought process was people just want reform. They don't care how we get there. And he's even said he thinks that Chicago will get the same level of police reform under this agreement with the Trump administration as it would under a federal judge. A lot of people disagree with that. But I do think that by making that calculation and releasing it late on a Friday afternoon, as is typical when they try to bury something, when we continue to report the story and continue to ask questions. You don't just need a Justice Department to do a consent decree. Lots of experts say you can partner with the ACLU or community organizations and enter court voluntarily. The prospect of a lawsuit also has been hanging out there, and as you mentioned, there's one been filed. So it was kind of like a snowball, and it kept rolling down the hill and getting bigger. And then when Attorney General Lisa Madigan stepped in and called for this consent decree, who, by the way, was the same person who was among the first to call for the Justice Department investigation in the first place, which the mayor also initially was not on board with. So, I think this perhaps has become a bigger issue for him to deal with than perhaps he initially estimated.
Now, most of what I know about this, I know from reading this guy Bill Ruthhart in the Tribune, because you've been really kind of out there covering this, and I admire your coverage. But one of the things that I think I understand is that there's basically sort of like three options right now. Well, I mean, there's the consent decree, which ain't gonna happen. We just know that ain't gonna happen. And then there's some kind of federal or judicial oversight of some kind, which is wobbly, and I'm not quite sure I understand what that would be. And then this third path, which is just kind of, well, we'll go it on our own, and we'll write letters of agreement and all that, right? I mean, there really aren't any other buckets of possibilities.
Well, I mean, federal oversight could still take on the form of a consent decree, just not, with the Justice Department. The parties could be possibly different. But the end game is yes. I mean, you have three different options. You have the option of the Trump Justice Department going to court with the Emanuel administration and seeking a consent decree, yes, I would say that's probably off the table given
Let's just say it's unlikely.
Unlikely. Even the Justice Department hasn't said it's off the table when we've asked them. It seems unlikely. There's this memorandum of agreement option, which, the mayor's office likes to say, well, that could end up in court because what would happen is the Trump Justice Department and City Hall would have reached an agreement on what the reforms look like. An independent monitor, so-called independent monitor, would be appointed. I'm not sure who would choose it because they haven't said. And if that monitor had a problem and didn't think the agreed upon reforms, whatever they might be, which also haven't been made public, if those reforms aren't met, that monitor could ask the Justice Department to sue and go to court. Well, what are the chances that the Trump Justice Department is going to sue on police reform?
Right.
Highly unlikely.
Right.
So those are kind of the two bookend, one end or the other. The one in the middle is, or somewhere in the middle, is court oversight that's not initiated by the Justice Department. Well, what does that look like? It could be this lawsuit that was filed that could force the issue, and a judge could say, you know what, this needs
federal judge? Would it have to be a federal judge?
Typically, yeah. And I'm no legal scholar, but that is certainly a federal lawsuit, I believe. And so that's one route. Emanuel's administration could find a partner to go into court voluntarily. Some have suggested that could be Lisa Madigan's office. Some have suggested it could be the ACLU. It could be some other unknown group that has standing and concern about police reforms. So there's a lot of different routes to get there. There could be more lawsuits. We don't know. But what has definitely changed is you had a mayor who agreed to a consent decree, was pushed at the time of the press conference, says, Trump's coming in, you do believe in consent decrees. And his quote was, I wouldn't sign what I signed today if I didn't believe in consent decrees. So what has changed is a guy who was definitely believed in consent decree, thought it was necessary, federal court oversight necessary to get these police reforms, has now backed off of that position.
You just used this term that gets thrown around all the time, aside from consent decree, federal court oversight.
Yeah.
Can there be federal court oversight with the current Sessions DOJ? Can that exist?
If the Sessions DOJ wants it to.
Well,
but that's, again, seems unlikely, right? So that gets back to this memorandum of agreement, and the mayor's office spin on that is the monitor we agree with the Justice Department would be in charge of reviewing these things, and if that monitor, whoever that person is, doesn't like what's happening, they could ask the Justice Department to sue. Trump's Justice Department to sue to force police reforms, which again seems highly unlikely.
It does seem. So there are all of these moving parts, and all of them change almost daily, and they affect the outcome. But one of them is FOP. I mean, as you say, the FOP was all in for Trump. I presume many Chicago police officers are Trump supporters. They voted in a new administration that just takes it all the way to the limit. So what kind of a negotiating partner is the police union at this point?
Well, I don't know that the union has a lot of say in police reform at the end of the day if it ends up in court, right? I mean, you have a Justice Department investigation that came to some pretty damning conclusions. You have a mayor that signed that agreement after that investigation saying, yes, these are all problems that need to be addressed, and I believe a federal court should oversee them, right? The FOP is not really a party to that. Now, politically, they're a big factor, and there's a couple of reasons.
Well, I guess that's really why I'm
One
asking
is
that.
there's a new police contract that needs to be negotiated, and those negotiations are, I believe, ramping up now. And so you have a union that I think you characterize accurately has moved even further to, I guess you would call it the right of the previous FOP administration, and they want back certain things that they lost, and they have a very hardline stance on reforms. That said, we haven't heard them say a lot about details in articulating their positions. I know the new FOP president has been on a couple programs. Definitely says he doesn't think there's a need for a consent decree. He was asked, well, what about this memorandum of agreement? Well, we think we're doing just fine the way we are. I don't think he's
That's my memorandum of agreement.
Yeah, doesn't think that's necessary.
Everything's okay.
Now, the one thing that should be pointed out and said is that in the Justice Department investigation, there are parts of that report when you read them where they did solicit input from officers. And I don't think anyone, I haven't heard anyone disagree that the officers need more training, more consistent support from the department. And I think there are some areas where everyone agrees. The matter is, what does that training look like? I think the FOP is supportive of this hiring of 1,000 additional officers, which has come out of this. Now, how that happens, the quality of the candidates, the training time, all of that is something we're keeping a close eye on. So, I mean, there are a few areas of agreement that will help the city do a better job of policing. It's just the question of, you know, the reforms, how strict the oversight is, what those look like. And,
well, I mean, if we look back at Laquan McDonald and the DOJ report and the Police Accountability Task Force report that the mayor himself initiated, they were adamant in saying that some of these negotiated issues that involve the FOP are major impediments to any kind of police reform. Such things as the way that reports are written and handled after an incident, which we saw clearly in Laquan McDonald, the 24-hour waiting period, all those kinds of things. And I mean, I guess the question is, with those kinds of sort of immovable objects there, where the FOP is just simply saying, hell no, we're not going to do it. We're not going to move on these things. And no Justice Department to, you know, sort of kick things into gear. How much power does the mayor really have? What kind of reform can he really initiate?
Well, I mean, a contract's subject to negotiations, right? And if there's one thing Rahm Emanuel probably is pretty savvy at, it's negotiating. I'll give him that for sure. And so I think there's other things the police want besides their 24-hour waiting period to stay intact. There's certain things that perhaps they might be willing to give if they get better benefits or more pay or other things that cops want, right?
Because a lot of that stuff was given to them in lieu of pay.
Yeah, and I'm not an expert on the police contract. I certainly, don't have a sense of where the negotiations are, what the asks are at the starting point on each side. Those have been kept pretty quiet, but. The universe of a police contract is this. The police reform is part of that, and so there's other things they may want that they may be willing to give on other issues. And so, look, no question, Emanuel is in a difficult position. He's got to negotiate with this union that's not happy with him. He's got an eye toward running for a third term. He wants. The police are a reliable voting base that lives in the city of Chicago.
Except not for him, maybe.
Well, but you know what? At the end of the day, and there's going to be an election, who's running to the right of Rahm Emanuel for mayor? Somebody's going to be running to some or multiple people will be running to the left of him, right? He's moderate.
Point.
So maybe they stay home and they don't vote. I don't know, but I don't know a lot of officers that don't vote. So, I don't know. I mean, there's so many factors at play, which is what makes it so complex and interesting. But the public sentiment, and Lisa Madigan and Chuy Garcia and Tony Preckwinkles and many other members of the Progressive Caucus and the City Council, all believe that there's been so many different reports and efforts at reform in Chicago over the years when it comes to the police department, and none of it's ever really happened. And they all firmly believe that if we're really going to do it this time, you got to have somebody who's not a politician overseeing the process. And they're not doubting Emanuel's dedication toward reform. I think people genuinely, at least those people I listed, said that we're not questioning his commitment. It's just a matter of this should be removed from the political process. Budget considerations and things like that shouldn't color what the actual reforms are and how they get done. Now, if you're a mayor, you want control over things. You don't really like a federal judge trying to tell you how much you need to spend money on. But the counter argument to that is this problem is so big and so troublesome and has been around for so long, and the public doesn't trust the politicians to fix it. They would rather see a judge fix it.
We had Lori Lightfoot on the show a few weeks ago, and she said that the mayor made this announcement that when he got his Police Accountability Task Force report, he liked it so much he was going to implement the whole thing. And he did implement about 30-35% of it, and then stopped. And I guess that was probably the easy stuff.
Well, look, Emanuel is well known for a flurry of announcements to press releases and otherwise to convey a sense of momentum on the issue. I've written that numerous times.
Right.
And then
Announce, re-announce,
and you go back
pre-announce.
and you go back and check, and sometimes those things. To his credit, there's a new training policy. There's a new use of force policy.
Right.
There are more body cameras. There are more tasers. These are tangible things that did not exist before. There is a commitment and money for 1,000 new cops. Whether they're actually going to be able to hire and train them all in the time frame they've allotted, 2 years, is a huge undertaking. That said, he does get credit on some of those issues. Now, there are others he hasn't addressed, as Lightfoot correctly points out. We're still transitioning IPRA, the Police Oversight Board, to this new thing called COPA. There's questions on, well, do the same investigators that worked for IPRA that was broken now working for COPA? How does that change? There's supposed to be an oversight board for COPA that hasn't been put in place. So yeah, there are things that have not been done. I'd point out that Lightfoot, when we asked her about federal court oversight, didn't go as far as Preckwinkle and Madigan and some of these others and just flat out called for it. She seemed to suggest we got to live in the universe of the Trump Justice Department, which was somewhat surprising, given that even though she was Emanuel's appointed head of this task force, she's put pressure on him to implement reforms.
It's an intangible thing, but the reforms that the mayor lists, and you've, I think, correctly copied back: use of force policy, body cams, training. These are things that kind of tend to be budgetary items or bureaucratic items, but the really hard stuff is the public image stuff. It's the racism. It's the the way people are treated in the city by the police officers and that kind of thing, which I suppose might be a training issue. But those are things that are institutional.
You're getting more to the culture of the police department, yes, and certainly it's much harder to change a culture overnight, right? I do think body cameras and things of that nature, and these officers knowing that there's a video policy, at least that's supposed to release the videos in a timely fashion, although some of that is changed. If you're on tape and you got a thing around your neck that's recording what you're doing, your behavior might change a little bit, knowing. Well,
I've said that I think that the body cam thing is a real game changer. I think that it's not going to be immediate, but if you take a milepost like 10 years out and look back on this, you'll say this was a time when policing in America, well, in the world probably, really began to change.
Yeah, I mean, I think. There's also a lot of officers, set to retire, which is going to make the hiring 1,000 more difficult. That also gets to, culture change. Eddie Johnson says all the right things about wanting to change the culture of the department. He says that's why he took the job. I don't think, again, I haven't heard any elected officials question Eddie Johnson's commitment to reform or the mayor's, but it's a question of, I think, the commitment is there now, but when we're several years down the road, maybe with a different mayor, maybe with a different police superintendent, who may even have different views, or maybe they want to get most of the way there, but a judge would be the one that would push them the extra mile to really make
That's the problem with this thing,
change.
is that it's a long-term commitment. You have to sign some kind of a document that says that 6 years, 8 years, 10 years from now, we're still going to be working on this, and somebody's job is to hold our feet to the fire. Elections, as we know, have consequences, right? So elections can just throw everything into a cocked hat.
Yeah, and it gets to transparency too. And again, the mayor's office has said this potential deal or negotiation with the Trump Justice Department would have regular reports that tell you what's going on. Well, what does that look like, right? There's no transparency even in the release of this memo of agreement. If you're being transparent, all right, tell us what you offered them. Where did it start? Let's look at that, right? But they're only committing to releasing that once they reach a deal with the Trump Justice Department. Well, there's no input after the fact, right? So I think there's a lot of skepticism because you're negotiating with, especially in a very deep blue place like Chicago with a Trump administration, there's a lot of skepticism. People want to see facts. With the consent decree, the court files are there, what the judge says is there, what the problems are, what the metrics are. You're supposed to do this, you're supposed to have this many hours of training. Did they do it or not? The monitor goes and looks.
Yes or no.
They audit it, and everybody will know. So the mayor says, well, you will be transparent about it, but the court guarantees it. And,
Right.
whether this mayor
Trust
has a
but
policy
verify.
and transparency, but another one might not. And it took decades to get here. It's going to take decades to fix it.
Is there a living, breathing human being in Chicago who could be so trusted that they could be an independent monitor and both sides would actually respect and trust them? I don't know.
That's what I would call.
Archbishop?
That's what I would call a loaded question,
Yeah.
Mr. Davis. I don't know. Look, I think people would probably trust a judge to make that decision than to politicians.
Ed
whether it's
Eisendrath.
Jeff Sessions.
There's one. Ed Eisendrath.
I think he's trying to own a newspaper. Isn't he? That's
right.
what I heard.
Yeah. Okay, we've got a couple of minutes, and I want to do a couple other things, but I also want to ask you about, and I know you've written about experience in other cities. I mean, it's often said in shorthand that the Justice Department consent decrees in other cities really have made a huge impact, and they've really improved things. But that's not necessarily always the case, is it?
Well, I mean, I think there's a difference between consent decrees that have happened elsewhere, and there's a couple places that have these memo of agreements. And my colleague Dan Hinkle and actually Annie Sweeney are the real experts on this that have looked at other jurisdictions. But I know, in LA, they had a consent decree, and it's widely viewed as a success. I think some of these other places, there's been a couple that the mayor's office has pointed to that have memos of agreements. They're much smaller departments, Las Vegas, Cincinnati. Cincinnati actually ended up in court anyway, so as an odd example for them to point to. But these other departments, it was one part of the department, one particular issue. I think the three cities they pointed to as examples where these memos they thought were successful don't even add up to the size of the Chicago Police Department. And obviously the depth of the problems here is a different thing. So LA, big, huge department, lots of problems, consent decree, largely viewed as a success. And I think that's why people point to Chicago needing something similar.
Yeah. Should we change subject just briefly? We've got a few minutes left. You've written about Rahm Emanuel's emails and lobbying, that there's a new way of lobbying. You just email the mayor on his cell phone. But it's a weird story. What's going on?
Well, to explain the story, we got to go back to how we got the emails, which is for years we've been FOIAing the mayor's electronic communications, and there was never much there. Tribune filed a lawsuit saying, we think you use personal email to do government business. That's public record, hand it over. The BGA filed a suit not long after that, seeking the same thing. In our case, I guess it was December, judge ruled that, Mayor, you need to give us basically an accounting of all your emails, a log basically of your emails.
On your personal device.
From your personal email, which is mayorre@rahmemail.com or something like that. And so when the judge ordered that index, not too long after that, the mayor settled with the BGA in their lawsuit and released thousands of emails. And it turns out, lo and behold, he's been using his personal email to do all kinds of government business and email all kinds of people. And I think one of the unintended consequences that perhaps folks didn't realize when he released all this is in these emails, which, by the way, aren't to Joe Q public. They are all, corporate CEOs and big-time campaign donors and Washington
it's not
insiders.
like, hey, Mr. Mayor, could you help me with my building permit for my garage?
No, there are a couple
like
very influential people asking for stuff like that, but not
but
regular
just a
taxpayers.
Bigger scale.
And so, what's interesting is that is lobbying. If you ask the mayor to influence a city action, you have to register as a lobbyist. And so we found like 26 people in these emails, a minimum. There's some that were borderline that we left out, that were asking for things, didn't register. Turns out there's a $1,000 a day penalty if you don't register as a lobbyist.
That's amazing, yeah.
Which is stiff. So if they were to pursue a maximum penalty of that, it's like millions and millions of dollars in potential fines for these folks. David Plouffe with Uber was one of the people in the emails. Asked the mayor for some help on the ride-sharing ordinance. 90 days, he didn't register, got a $90,000 fine. So we had a couple new, the Board of Ethics is the board that looks at this. They don't have any investigative powers, so they've never really done much on this front in terms of, they've gotten people for not, dinged them from registering late and stuff like that, but not really found evidence of people lobbying the mayor without registering. So now they have all these emails and news accounts to read and say, oh, well, we can find these people. And so there were a couple more cases recently. Jim Abrams, a good friend of the mayor's, big campaign donor, trying to get the mayor to consider a friend's pitch to be exempt from the minimum wage ordinance. There was the husband of Alderman Sophia King. She wasn't an alderman at the time, but later was appointed alderman by the mayor, looking for the Park District to get a fence moved for his, music festival picnic at a Southside Park. So there's many more of these examples, some a little more substantial than just a fence in a park, Airbnb, airlines lobbying the mayor over certain things. So we'll continue to keep an eye on that and report on those.
But if you're registered as a lobbyist, then it's okay for you to write to the mayor and say, hey, could you have that fence taken down because I got a big party I want to throw in the
Yes, but even
park?
when you do that, you have to report every contact you have with somebody. So there are a couple people that are registered. There's a lobbyist for United Airlines who is registered, asked for the mayor sent a mayor proposal on a reform in O'Hara that dealt with gates at the airport, and he didn't report that contact. It's a much smaller fine, but you even when you're registered, you have to report every time. Yeah, I talked to Alderman X about Y, and you got to put it in your report. Yeah.
Interesting. It is really interesting. I'll tell
Let's
you.
just say there's a lot more people that have been starting to register that perhaps have let theirs lapse or hadn't gotten around
that'll help
to
the
it,
Illinois budget, though. Suddenly people will have to put all that money into their registration fees. Bill, thank you so much. I always enjoy having you on the show, and you've been writing some great stuff in the Tribune, and all your colleagues. There's been some, especially the thing last week we had a discussion about the tax reform, the property tax stuff with Jason Garotto. So you're doing some good work over there. Good to see journalism alive and well in Chicago.
We appreciate it, and thanks for having me on. Always a pleasure.
Right. Thanks. Bill Ruthhart is with the Tribune, and we hope to have him back again sometime soon. And you are watching Chicago Newsroom. We'll be right back.